How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. Today, we're going to do something I wasn't actually planning on doing. We're going to do a little bit of coverage on the Fallout Precons with what I call a 5 in, 5 out strategy, where I'm going to take out 5 cards and replace 5 cards in each of the Precons just to give them a little light upgrading. And the ground rules are simple, that I don't use any named legends from any of the other Magic properties or the other universes beyonds. And we're going to see what we can come up with to make these just a little bit stronger. Now, why do I all of a sudden have an interest? Well, I'm incredibly lucky, and I won all 4 precons in a contest. Word to the wise, if you have a Twitter account, check out other Magic creators. There's lots of them doing contests on there. This one was from at Tron is Bad, and he also has a Twitch channel. Check him out. Great content. And you can get all kinds of stuff. I've won other precons, deck boxes, and other things like that. So, with that said, let's take a look at these precons and see what I've come up with to try to give them a light goosing. To kick this off, let's start off with the Scrappy Survivors deck, led by Dogmeat Everloyal and backed up by Preston Garvey Minuteman. This is a red, white, and green equipment and auras deck that's all about beefing up your creatures with said equipment and auras. So what can we do with that? Well, let's start with a card that I'm going to kick to the curb in Acquired Mutation. 2 in a red. It's an aura that says enchanted creature gets +2/+2 and is goaded, and whenever the enchanted creature attacks, the defending player gets 2 rad counters. Now, if you watch my content long enough, you know one of the first things I cut from most of these precons are the Impetus cards. This is shiny Impetus with a Fallout flavor attached to it. It doesn't make me like it any better, though. The fact that this precon doesn't care about rad counters and it just doesn't compel me to keep it around. On top of that, this kind of thing is what you want to put on your opponent's creatures, but the theme of the deck is more about putting enchantments on your own creatures. So for that reason, I'm going to kick it out of the deck. Instead, I'm actually going to include a new card from Outlaws of Thunder Junction that actually allows us to get our suited up creatures across the board, because this is going to be more about going tall than it is going wide. And oftentimes you're going to have an issue where you can have a bunch of equipment and auras on your creature, but you just can't punch through because there's not an evasive card to have access to. The precon itself only gives you 3 ways of granting evasion to your creatures, with Behemoth Sledge granting trample, Rancor granting trample, or the Agility Bobblehead, which gives creatures like a Gingerbrute style ability to make it unblockable unless the defending creature has haste. That's it. So let's swap that out, the Acquired Mutation, since it's not really about evasion anyways, and it's going to clear some attack lanes for us using Final Showdown. It's one of the new spree cards that does a board wipe, but it also has another couple of modes that really work out for us here. So for a base of a white, you get a spree choice of either 1 and a white, choose all creatures lose abilities until end of turn, 1 and a white, choose a creature you control, it gains indestructible, or 3 white, destroy all creatures. So for a total of 5 triple white, you get to make everything lose their abilities. Your 1 creature you want survive will then gain indestructible because these all resolve in order, and then everything is destroyed. So this is an amazing board wipe, and I think it's going to be quite expensive in the future. So if you're a white mage, I'd highly recommend getting your hands on one of these sooner or later anyways. And Final Showdown in this deck allows you to deal with, pesky indestructible creatures gumming up the attack lanes, and just, everything loses the abilities, you blow up everything, and you're going to have 1 creature left standing. Your suited up, auraed up creature that you couldn't punch through before can now hit your opponents. Then I'm going to cut out the copy of Squirrel Nest, 1 green enchant land. The land taps to create a squirrel token. Aside from just being an aura that Dogmeat can get back with its ETB trigger, this deck really doesn't care about squirrel tokens other than it being a cutesy thing with dogs chasing squirrels. Otherwise, there really isn't much synergy here, and it's slow. So instead, let's get another piece of evasion in this deck, and it also acts as protection as well, with Canopy Cover. For 1 and a green, it's an enchantment aura. Enchant creature. Enchanted creature cannot be blocked except by creatures with flying or reach, and the enchanted creature can't be the target of spells or abilities your opponents control. So if you don't have a flyer or a reach creature, too bad, you're going to get hit here and you can't block what I have suited up. And if you don't have a board wipe, nope, you can't target this thing either, can't get rid of it. I didn't even know about this card, and I love it for this deck. The third cut for the deck is a Valorous Stance. For 1 and a white, choose 1. Target creature you control is indestructible, or destroy target creature, toughness 4 or greater. Overall, this card is just so underwhelming, and it shows up in so many white precons. It's nice to have when you need it, but it just kind of feels blah. So instead, I want to get something that doesn't make me feel that way with Gaia's Gift. 1 and a green instant, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. It gains reach, trample, hexproof, and indestructible until end of turn. That way you protect your stuff. We lose the removal option, but then we gain a much better protection spell for the swap. Not only do we get indestructibility, but we also can gain hexproof to handle handle exile spells and enchantments that target and do exiling effects. We can also use it defensively by granting something reach at instant speed, as well as pumping up to surprise a flying attacker. Or we can even use it offensively to not only get the pump, but also trample to punch through. Lots of versatility for the same mana value as the remove spell, and I like it here much, much better. The number 4 card I'm cutting from this deck is Duchess Wayward Tavern Keep. For 300 red, it's a legendary creature, human citizen. It has an ability that says, whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, put a quest counter on it. And you can pay 1 and remove a quest counter from a permanent you control to create a junk token, and it's a 4/3. So far in my experience with this deck is that you're not often going to be swinging wide as you are tall, but you need to hit with multiple creatures to really get Duchess going. And the Precon only really has 18 creatures in it to start with, and only a couple cards that actually make tokens, one of which we've already removed from the deck for being pretty slow and non-synergistic to begin with. So the junk token theme of this deck is how it usually gets some kind of form of card draw, quote unquote. So let's get a different route to that exile draw in Connecting the Dots. For 1 in a red, it's an enchantment that says whenever a creature you control attacks, exile the top card of your library face down. And then you get 1 in a red, discard your hand, sacrifice Connecting the Dots to put all those exile cards into your hand. So it's a lower amount of mana investment up front. We don't actually have to have a bunch of creatures hit and an opponent to actually get the cards like you do with Duchess. You just swing, the cards get banked, and then when you need them, you just pop this and everything will come to your hand rather than getting exiled, and then you have to play them or lose them with the junk tokens. The only downside is that you don't get the junk tokens to synergize with Artifacts Matters cards, but it's a trade I'm willing to make to get the cards a little more easily. And then the last removal from the deck is going to be our other token creator that come in the Precon, and that is Animal Friend. For 1 in a green, it's an enchantment aura that says enchant creature. Enchanted creature has whenever this creature attacks, create a 1/1 green squirrel creature token. Put a +1/+1 counter on that token for each aura and equipment attached to this creature other than Animal Friend. So you make a squirrel, and then for everything else that's on it other than this particular aura, you put a counter on that squirrel. So like with Squirrel Nest, this is slow and does nothing for the creature that it enchants. It just requires a bunch of extra things to happen in order to make it worth playing. And by the time you get enough stuff on a creature and then use this on that creature, you're simply better off improving the souped up creature instead of worrying about making that one big squirrel at a time. Instead, we're going to slot in a copy of Nettlecyst. For 3 colorless, you get an artifact equipment living weapon. So when it enters, it comes in with a 0/0 Phyrexian Germ token, and you attach it to it. The equipped creature gets +1/+1 for each artifact or enchantment you control. So it's a 1/1 no matter what, because you're playing the Nettlecyst, and it equips for 2. Now, yes, I know it is counterintuitive to add this to the deck after I've already had the Duchess removed from the deck that makes junk tokens, but in the 3 or 4 games that I've played in this Precon, she doesn't make more than 2 or 3 junk tokens in a given game, and it's not a huge boon for the Nettlecyst anyhow. But with all the other enchantments, equipment, and junk token creators in the deck, the Nettlecyst is going to make whatever you have holding it into a very large threat. And then when you couple that with something that grants trample or some other form of evasion, someone's going to feel some pain on that particular attack. Now moving on to the next deck, and probably my favorite of the Fallout Precons, let's get into Mutant Menace, the blue, black, and green counters deck. The Wise Mothman and the Master Transcendent are the possibilities included in the Precon as your commander, irradiating the table to hurt our opponents or to self-mill things into the grave so we can bring them back. The deck is pretty good out of the box, but I think we can do a little better in some areas. So let's start off by removing Harmonize. 2 green sorcery, draw 3 cards. I want to bring in something a little more synergistic to the deck, and I think this choice will give us some fun to work with in Grim Flowering. 5 and a green, it's a sorcery, draw a card for each creature card in your graveyard. It's slower, but it has a much higher ceiling than Harmonize. Grim Flowering can take advantage of all the rad counters milling our own cards into the graveyard, and allows us to get a bigger burst of cards, and it does not need double green to be cast, which is a little bit harder to do in a 3-color deck. Then I'm going to go ahead and cut out Fraying Sanity. For 2 and a blue, it's an Aura Curse. Enchant player at the beginning of each end step, enchanted player mills X cards, where X is the number of cards put into their graveyard from anywhere this turn. Most of the time, you're going to want your rad counters damaging your opponents. The mill is just kind of a secondary thing, and it's very hard to mill an opponent out in Commander due to their deck sizes. So instead, I'm going to slot in Eldritch Pact. For 6 and a black, it's a sorcery. Target player draws X cards and loses X life, where X is the number of cards in their graveyard. Instead of trying to mill down one of my opponents, I'm going to use the Eldritch Pact to supplement the damage from those rad counters, and we're going to leverage all those milled cards into a burst of damage. And in an emergency emergency, I can even use this to draw a pile of cards for myself. Either way, it's a good card to use in the deck. The third cut from the precon for me is going to be Nuke Launcher. It's an equipment for 2 that says equipped creature gets +3/+0 and Intimidate. And whenever a creature attacks until the end of the defending player's next turn, that player gets 2 rad counters whenever they cast a spell, and it equips for 3. This has a few weaknesses that I don't like. One, if you're depending on this to get a bunch of rad counters on an opponent, you have to know more often, guess, which opponent is going to try to spam a bunch of spells so they get loaded up on the rad counters and go after them. On top of that, I don't rely on my opponents to have to spam a bunch of spells to get lit up by the trigger, because that usually means they're going to go off and those counters really don't mean anything because they're probably coming off to win on the spot. The other weakness that I really don't like with this is the Intimidate factor. We're in a 3-color deck. If you strap this to a 3-colored creature, then you're going to have stuff being able to block it more often because you're more likely going to run across one of those 3 colors rather than like Intimidate's better with a monocolored creature because it's a lot harder to block in that case. So instead, I'm going to put in a copy of Gaia's Blessing. For 1 ingredients of sorcery, target player shuffles up to 3 cards from their graveyard into their library, draw a card, and whenever it is put into your graveyard from your library, shuffle your graveyard into your library. So while this doesn't have anything to do with rad counters, it fills a need for us. Something that I have noticed with this deck is I've accidentally decked myself or nearly decked myself several times. How do I do that? Well, when you have things like Strong the Brutish Thespian, it turns the rad counter damage into life gain for us. The same thing with the Glowing one. These things just go ahead and keeps us alive and nets us life. And then if they stick around for too long, you increase your chances of accidentally decking yourself. Enter Gaia's Blessing for us as a remedy to this. Even if you draw it, you can use to get 3 select cards that might have gotten milled away earlier in the game or you just want to use again, and then shuffle them back in. So it's never a dead card even if you accidentally draw it. The 4th cut from the deck is going to be Biomass Mutation for X and 2 hybrid Simic colors, green-blue. It's an instant. Creatures you control have base power and toughness XX until end of turn. This card is very It's really only good in one scenario, when an opponent cannot block because they overcommitted their attacks or they just choose not to block and then you dump all your mana into this as a surprise blowout. It doesn't grant trample. It doesn't grant any other kind of evasion. For that reason, I'm not a fan of this card. Instead, I'm going to give the deck some extra reach that will hit every opponent with Dreadhound. For 4 black, you get a Demon Dog that says when it enters the battlefield, mill 3 cards, and whenever a creature dies or a creature card is put into a graveyard from a library, each opponent loses 1 life, and it's a 6/6. If you want to max out on this kind of effect, you could include Sir Conrad the Grim, but I wanted to avoid the named legends for the 5 cards I was going to swap out in these decks. That said, Dreadhound leans hard into these rad counters. No matter where they are milled from, a creature hits the bin, our opponents are all going to lose a life for it, and that really amps up the damage off those rad counters as they start milling. I love this card, and I think it's going to help the rad counters burn down your opponents. The 5th and final cut from the Mutant Menace deck I'm going to take out here is Recon Craft Theta. For 4, it's a vehicle flyer that says when it enters the battlefield, create a 0/0 blue alien creature token with a 1/1 counter on it, and whenever it attacks, proliferate, so you can make the thing bigger, and it crews for 2, and it's a 4/4. So I'm not a real big fan of this card because you have to expose it to removal to actually get the proliferate off of it, and I have a much better card in mind, and that is Staff of Completion, 3 colorless. Pay a life and tap it to do a bunch of different type of effects. Pay 1, you get to blow up something that you own. So if they steal something from you with like a blue steal spell, you can still blow it up later down the line because you own the card. You can either then pay 2, tap it for mana, pay 3, proliferate, pay 4, draw a card, or just pay 5 mana to untap it and do any one of those other things again. So this has a lot more versatility to it, and I like it a lot better than the Recon Craft. So that's it for the Mutant Menace deck. Let's move on to what many call the least powerful of the precons, Science. The red, white, and blue deck that's all about robots and led by Madison Lee and Liberty Prime Recharged. You build up energy counters, then use them to fuel the robots or special abilities of other cards in the deck. So after a few games, yes, this is the weakest of the precons straight out of the box, but I think we can get it some help. Let's start off by cutting out Dispatch. White, instant, tap target creature, but if you control 3 or more artifacts and have Metalcraft, it exiles instead. This could be a powerful card, but once in a while, it just kind of sits in your hand taunting you. I'll have a couple artifacts early game and then I just can't hit the Metalcraft, and just tapping a creature isn't even worth using the spell. I want to get something a little less conditional for removal, and it can net us another artifact in the process. Coming straight out of Outlaws of Thunder Junction, Assimilation Aegis. For 1, a white and a blue. It's an artifact equipment. When an Assimilation Aegis enters the battlefield, exile 1 target creature until it leaves the battlefield. And when Assimilation Aegis becomes attached to a creature, for as long as it remains attached to that creature, it becomes a copy of the exiled creature, and it equips for 2. So this is a new variation on a banishing light effect, but we can use it to turn our worst creature into whatever creature we've exiled with the Assimilation Aegis. And more often than not, you're going to take out something really good your opponents wanted to have stick around and give it to ourselves. So go ahead, opponents, play your big bomb creatures. They will soon be assimilated and bend to my will. The second cut from this precon is going to be Red Death Shipwrecker. Blue-red crab mutant with tap, goad target creature an opponent controls. That player draws a card. You add a red to your mana pool, and it's a 1/3. Apologies to the Red Death fans, but I just don't like this crab. The goad and the mana is nice, but the killer here is giving an opponent a card without other ways to punish them for drawing that card. And you messing with their creature isn't likely to keep you in their good graces for very long. So instead, we're going to have a similar effect without the card benefit for our opponents. So let's take a look at Laser Screwdriver. For 3 colorless, it's an artifact. Taps to add a mana of any color, or you can pay 1 in a tap, tap an artifact, pay 2 in a tap, surveil 1, or 3 in a tap, goad target creature. So we get our mana ability, we get a goad ability, and then we have 2 bonus abilities in surveil 1 or tapping a target artifact down. No card drawing for our opponent at the cost of a little more mana to work with this thing and to get a goad off of it. I like this much, much better. The next cut for the deck is going to be Vault 13 Dweller's Journey, 3 and a white saga. Chapter 1, each player exile up to 1 other target enchantment or creature that player controls until Vault 13 leaves the battlefield. Chapter 2, gain 2 life, scry 2. And Chapter 3, return 2 cards exiled with Vault 13 to the battlefield under their owner's control and put the rest on the bottom of their owner's libraries. Now, when it comes to exiling enchantments, I would much rather play something like a Grasp of Fate over this, just for the fact that we're not limited on what kind of permanents we can target other than they have to be non-lands. And we don't have to give them things back on the 3rd chapter because it just sits there until somebody blows it up. Instead, we're going to go ahead and slot something else into the deck that I would much rather use, and it's actually a way to get energy for our stuff going in the deck, and that is Decoction Module. For 2 colorless, it's an artifact that whenever a creature enters the battlefield under our control, you get an energy counter, and then you can pay 4 and tap to return target creature you control to its owner's hand. This deck needs a ton of energy to fire on time, but it lacks a lot of repeatable ways of getting energy counters. So enter the Decoction Module. Every creature entering on our side will give us an energy counter, and that includes things like synth tokens off of Sean, Father of the Synths. And since there is a nice bonus mode attached to this one to allow us to bounce a creature back to our hand, which is good for reusing ETB triggers to generate energy or any other ETBs we might have in the deck, or just simply save a creature facing a destruction spell. The 4th cut from the deck, though, is going to be Curie Emergent Intelligence. For 1 and a blue, it's a robot that says whenever it deals combat damage to a player, draw cards equal to its base power. And 1 and a blue, exile another non-token artifact creature you control. It becomes a copy of the exiled creature and has the ability to say whenever it deals combat damage to a player, draw cards equal to the base power, and it's a 1/3. Without a lot of ways to make stuff unblockable, this card has absolutely sucked for me when I've used it. And even when it does hit, the part about base damage really limits the amount of cards you can get off of Curie unless you exile a different, much larger artifact creature, and it cannot be a token version of anything. The only creature I would be fully comfortable with exiling this, and it's only if I used it as the commander, is Liberty Prime Recharge. At least then we can get the original Liberty Prime back to post, and if Curie gets removed later or dies because you can't pay the cost of the energy when you attack or whatever, we can at least recast from the command zone and keep Liberty Prime around. But otherwise, I usually use Dr. Madison Lee as the front face, which makes this much worse. Instead, let's get some more energy generation in the deck with Era of Innovation. For 1 and a blue enchantment, whenever an artifact or an artificer enters the battlefield under your control, you can pay 1, and if you do, you get 2 energy counters, and you can pay 6 energy counters and sacrifice the Era of Innovation to draw 3. So this deck is chock full of artifacts and artifact token generation, so we should be able to throw some spare mana into this and net a bunch of extra energy counters throughout a game. The card draw is just a nice bonus if we might need it. Otherwise, I'm going to let this thing sit and ride it out. And then the last card I'm going to take out of this deck is Thought Vessel. 2 colorless artifact, tap, at a colorless and you have no max hand size. It is not often in this deck that I've had a maxed out hand and I needed to remove the cap on my hand size. And more often than not, I need colored mana more than colorless, so it makes it very expendable in the deck. Instead, I want to slot in a card that will allow us a unique function in the deck with Master Transmuter for 3 and a blue. It's a human artificer, blue and tap, return target artifact you control to its owner's hand. You may put an artifact card from your hand onto the battlefield. So with the Transmuter, we can do a few things. We can bounce an artifact with an ETB so we can recast it and reuse the ETB effect. We can use it to save an artifact from destruction, or we can just use the whole activated ability to bounce an artifact and then put a more expensive artifact into play. There's a wide range of possibilities with the Transmuter in this deck. And then moving on to the last precon, let's take a look at Hail Caesar, the red, white, and black deck led by Caesar, Legion's Emperor, and Mr. House, President and CEO. So do you like tokens? Well, this deck has you covered because it focuses on overwhelming your opponents with creature tokens. So let's see what we can do to help to make this deck out just a little bit better. My first cut is a card that I just really do not like, and that is Yes Man, Personal Securitron. For 2 and a white, it's a robot. Tap, target opponent gains control of Yes Man. Whenever they do, you draw 2 cards and put a quest counter on it. Activate only during your turn, and then it has, when it leaves the battlefield, its owner creates a tapped 1/1 white and soldier token for each quest counter on it. This thing is White's version of a humble defector, and like the defector, I really just don't like this card for the same reasons. Very rarely are you going to get more than just the 2 cards off of it, because no one's really going to give it to you back. And it's not, they're not going to sacrifice it. You're going to have to blow the entire board just to get these things off of it, or somebody's going to do something to it and get rid of it right away. So you're only going to get maybe 1 or 2 tokens off of it. So I'm not a fan of this card. Instead, let's get some other card draw in the deck that doesn't have the chance of backfiring in our face. Let's get some Smuggler's Share in here. For 2 and a white enchantment, at the beginning of each end step, draw a card for each opponent who drew 2 or more cards this turn, and then create a treasure token for each opponent who had 2 or more lands enter the battlefield under their control this turn. So this way, we're not going to give our opponents a chance to benefit themselves by drawing cards off of it. We don't have to wait for Summoning Sickness to try to get the cards off of this thing. You could be drawing by the end of your opponent's next turn, and it repeats each time an opponent goes to feel their hand or goes to ramp up. I'm much more comfortable with this as a way to get extra cards and extra ramping in the deck. Then we have another creature I don't like, and I'm going to cut from my version of the precon, and that is Ruthless Rad Rat. For 1 black rat mutant with squad, exile 4 cards from your graveyard, and it has a menace and 2/2. Losing cards from my graveyard isn't a great plan for copying a 2/2, especially when it's 4 cards. That's a lot. And to do it each time you want to squad up, you got to take 4 cards out of your graveyard. It's just not impressive enough for that kind of cost to justify that squad cost. And you're likely not going to have enough to do this more than maybe 1 time when you do it. If I want a squad copying card and one that helps the deck much better than the rat, then I'm going to dip into a different Universes Beyond set, and I'm going to slot in Ultramarines Honor Guard. For 3 and a white. It's an Astartes Warrior with squad, 2 colorless. Other creatures you control get +1/+1, and it's a 2/2. This deck likes generating lots of little tokens, and being able to squat up this thing more than just 1 time will turn your 1/1s into 3/3s, and anything more that you can spare into making more copies of this can really pour on pressure in the late game. The third cut from the deck I want to make is the Nipton Lottery. For 2 black-red sorcery, choose a creature at random. You gain control of that creature until end of turn. Untap it, it gains haste until end of turn, and then destroy all other creatures. Sure, it's a cheap board wipe, but at 4 mana and a super random chance of hitting one of your own creatures and having it survive is a little much to rely on. You're more likely to hit an opponent's creature, and then you'll be giving it back at the end of the turn. Coupling that with just not being able to affect indestructible creatures, I'm not very happy with this. So instead, we're going to circle back to one of our prior recommendations for the Scrappy Survivors deck with Final Showdown. I won't explain it again here, but we already recommended this one, but it's also good here. So for more mana than the Nipton Lottery, but also castable at instant speed, it allows us to control which creature will be saved rather than the random nature of the lottery. I want my stuff to live, not theirs. The fourth cut I want to make is a card that doesn't really make sense within this deck, and that is Stolen Strategy. For 4 red, it's an enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, exile the top card of each opponent's library. Until end of turn, you may cast spells from among the exiled cards, and you may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast the spells. For this deck, randomly swiping spells from our opponents isn't a great use of a slot in the deck. I already have enough of my own spells I want to cast. I don't want to take a turn off casting my opponent's stuff that may not even work with what we're trying to do. On top of that, Stolen Strategy can often just paint a target on you for messing with your opponent's cards. I'll play this enchantment in a deck where I have a concentration of theft effects or chaos decks or something like that, where I want that kind of randomness going on, but this is not that kind of deck. What I think Stolen Strategy is trying to do is kind of be a pseudo card draw for the deck without making something like a Black Market Connections fit this Fallout world. Instead, I'm going to use a card I think will work well within the deck that isn't Black Market Connections, and that is Folk Hero. For 1 and a white, it's a background that says commander creatures you have, whenever you cast a spell that shares a creature type with this creature, draw a card. The ability triggers once per turn. This deck is full of humans and soldiers, and that's what Caesar is a human and a soldier, and we need our commander to really make the deck run anyways. So this is a nice way to draw cards simply for playing the game while Caesar is on the board. And then last but not least of the removals from this deck is Desdemona Freedom's Edge. For 2, a red and a white, human rogue with vigilance, 3/4. Whenever it attacks, target creature in your graveyard that's an artifact or what has mana value 3 or less gains escape until end of turn. The escape cost is equal to its mana cost plus exile 2 other cards from your graveyard. Now, while I find recursion effective in games of Commander, the limiting factor of a mana value of 3 or less and having to recast the card from the graveyard and exiling 2 more cards to get something off of this, that's more hoops and cost than I want to pay with a card like this. It's just, it seems to fit something better like the Science deck, because you can go get artifact creatures like the robots back without, you can go get stuff that's bigger back. Instead, I want to use Redemption Choir for 2 white, Vampire Cleric with lifelink and Coven. Whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, if you have the Coven ability of 3 or more creatures with different powers, return target permanent card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield, and it is a 3/3. It's 1 less toughness and you need to Coven to get the trigger, but I'd rather try for that than trying to pay mana and exile extra cards just to get a similar effect. And the Choir has an ETB version of its effect on it, whereas Desdemona has to attack to get anything. So unless you give her haste, you may not get anything for the mana spent. The Choir also has 1 subtle difference making it slightly better. It gets any kind of permanent back, not just creatures and artifacts. So you might have a low mana aura or some other enchantment, planeswalkers, or even battles that you might want to bring back, and the Choir can actually get at them as it enters the battlefield and on the attack, only needing Coven to get it done. So those are the cards I'm looking forward to actually adding into my precons and try to just give them a slight bump in the power level. So what did you guys think? Is there something you would rather try out in your versions of the Fallout precons? Let me know down in the comments below. And as always, thank you for watching. Have a great day. If you like what's going on here, please like, comment, subscribe. All those things help to push us up into the algorithm and helps the channel grow as I'm on my road to my first 1,000 subscribers. I highly appreciate it, and I will see you in the next video.